Picture a soldier standing in standing water that never drains, in boots that never dry. A situation so common on the Western Front that British medical records logged roughly 20,000 cases just from one winter. His foot has gone numb days ago. Underneath the sock, the flesh has already started to die. He is not being punished, he is not lost. Case after documented case shows this was simply where the war put him, in a trench on the Western Front, in a conflict that was supposed to be over by Christmas 1914. Here is the part almost nobody tells you. For thousands of men like him, a bullet through the shoulder was not a tragedy. It was the best day of the war. Soldiers had a name for it, a Blighty wound, an injury just serious enough to get you shipped home, but not serious enough to kill you. Men prayed for one. Some historians have documented cases of soldiers deliberately exposing a hand or a foot above the parapet, hoping a sniper's bullet would end their war for them without ending their life. Today we're going into the trench itself. Not the version from the recruitment posters, but the one from the letters, the medical reports, and the diaries the soldiers themselves left behind. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why so many men on the Western Front stopped fearing the enemy's rifle and started fearing the ground beneath their own feet. This is Warblind. Let's go down into the trench. By early 1915, the war of movement that both sides expected had collapsed. Machine guns and artillery made open field advances suicidal, so armies on both sides did the only thing that gave them a chance of survival. They dug. Within months, a continuous line of trenches stretched roughly 700 kilometers from the coast of Belgium all the way to the Swiss border. It's easy to picture a trench as a single ditch. It wasn't. The real system was a maze, a front-line trench facing the enemy, a support trench a short distance behind it, and a reserve trench further back still, all connected by zigzagging communication trenches. The zigzag pattern wasn't an accident of poor planning. If an enemy shell landed inside a straight trench, the blast and shrapnel would travel the entire length of it. Angled walls limited the damage to a single short section. Between the two front lines sat a stretch of ruined ground that soldiers called no man's land. Churned earth, shattered trees, and tangles of barbed wire, sometimes only 50 meters wide, sometimes several hundred. It was close enough that, on a still night, a man could hear the enemy coughing in the darkness. Life in this system followed a rough rotation. Units typically spent a stretch of days in the front-line trench, then rotated back to a support or reserve position, and eventually further back still for a few days of actual rest before the cycle began again. In theory, this rotation was meant to limit exposure to the worst conditions. In practice, over the course of a full deployment, most soldiers still spent a significant share of their war standing in that front-line mud, exposed to the elements and the constant threat of death. Food, when it arrived, came up the communication trenches at night in containers carried by hand, since daylight movement anywhere near the front line invited artillery fire. Bully beef, tinned corned beef, along with hard biscuits and jam made up much of a soldier's diet, often eaten cold because a fire risked giving away a position or simply wasn't practical in a flooded trench. Fresh bread and hot tea, when they made it up the line at all, were treated as small luxuries in letters home, brief moments of comfort in an otherwise miserable existence. Here's the open question we'll answer as this video goes on. How does a soldier survive months, sometimes years, in a hole in the ground built to survive an artillery war? And what does that survival actually cost him? Because the wounds that mattered most in the trenches weren't always the ones you could see. Flanders in Belgium sits on flat, low-lying clay ground with a naturally high water table. When British and German engineers dug their trenches there, they weren't just digging into soil. They were digging into what was practically a swamp waiting to happen. Add 3 or 4 years of artillery bombardment, which tore up the drainage systems and blasted craters that filled with rain, and the result was some of the worst mud in the history of warfare. During the Battle of Passchendaele in the autumn of 1917, the rain was so constant and the ground so churned that men, horses, and even tanks reportedly sank and drowned in the mud of shell craters. Official war diaries and later historical accounts describe soldiers losing their boots entirely to the suction of the mud, walking barefoot for the rest of a march because pulling a boot free wasn't worth the risk of losing balance under fire. This mud created one of the most common and most misunderstood injuries of the entire war. Trench foot. When feet stayed wet and cold for days without a chance to dry, the skin would soften, swell, and turn white, then blue, then black as tissue died. In severe, untreated cases, gangrene set in, and the only solution left was amputation. British medical records from the winter of 1914 to 1915 alone documented roughly 20,000 cases of trench foot in the British Army. 20,000 men permanently scarred or disabled just from the ground they were standing on. Military commanders eventually treated it as seriously as a bullet wound because, in a sense, it was just as effective at removing a soldier from the fight. Regulations were introduced requiring men to change their socks multiple times a day and rub whale oil into their feet as a barrier against the water. Some units reportedly went through thousands of gallons of whale oil in a single winter, just trying to keep their men's feet functional. Stop and sit with that for a second. An empire that had produced tanks, aircraft, and poison gas was also issuing orders about sock changes because the mud itself had become an enemy that outlasted every offensive, and the mud wasn't even the worst thing living in that trench with them. If you're finding this as unsettling as we did researching it, that's the point. Hit like now because it helps this channel keep telling these stories accurately, and there's a lot more ground to cover. Rats were not an occasional nuisance in the trenches. They were, by multiple soldier accounts, an infestation on a scale most people alive today have never witnessed. The conditions were perfect for them. Unburied bodies in no man's land, food scraps in the trenches, and warm sheltered burrows in the trench walls themselves. Veterans described rats the size of small cats, bold enough to run across a sleeping man's chest or steal food directly out of a soldier's hand. Because the rats fed on corpses left in no man's land after failed attacks, many soldiers regarded them with a specific kind of horror, not just as vermin, but as a living reminder of the men who hadn't made it back. Soldiers organized informal rat hunts with bayonets and improvised clubs, partly for morale and partly out of simple self-defense, since the population grew so quickly that a single breeding pair could theoretically produce hundreds of descendants within a year. Then there was the smaller enemy, lice. Nearly every soldier who spent extended time in the trenches became infested with body lice, which lived in the seams of uniforms and fed on human blood. Soldiers called the itching and irritation the trench itch. But lice caused something far worse than discomfort. They were the confirmed carrier of trench fever, a disease that produced sudden high fevers, headaches, and pain in the shins, so severe some men couldn't stand. Medical historians estimate trench fever affected as many as 1 million soldiers across both sides during the war, sidelining fighting men for weeks at a time, sometimes permanently altering their health and leaving them vulnerable. And through it all, there was very little way to actually get clean. Baths might be available once every 10 days or 2 weeks if a unit was lucky enough to be rotated back from the front line. Uniforms were often worn for that entire stretch, lice and all. Picture the layers here for a moment. A man standing in freezing water with dying flesh in his boots, lice biting through his uniform, rats brushing past his legs in the dark, and somewhere above the parapet, an enemy sniper waiting for him to make one careless movement. This is the setting that made a bullet wound feel to some men less like a curse and more like a way out. We're going to get to exactly why in a few minutes. But first, you need to understand the sound that never stopped. Artillery, not machine guns or rifles, caused the majority of casualties in the First World War. Historians estimate somewhere around 60% of all deaths and injuries came from shellfire. And the shelling wasn't a battle that started and stopped. In major offensives, bombardments sometimes lasted for days without pause. Before the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, British artillery fired for a full week straight, launching over 1.5 million shells at German positions before the infantry ever left their trenches. Soldiers described a specific psychological toll that came just from the constant noise and the impossibility of predicting where the next shell would land. There was no pattern to learn, no safe rhythm to count on, just the whistle of an incoming round and the fraction of a second to decide whether it was close enough to duck for. Men who had faced enemy soldiers in direct combat and held their nerve would later describe artillery bombardment as the far more frightening experience, precisely because there was nothing to fight back against. You could not shoot at a shell. It was a completely helpless waiting game. This constant exposure to bombardment produced a condition the military at first didn't understand at all, and initially treated as cowardice or weakness of character. They called it shell shock. Early in the war, British doctors genuinely believed shell shock was caused by physical concussive damage from nearby explosions, a literal shaking of the brain inside the skull. But army doctors soon documented cases of severe shell shock in men who had never even been near an exploding shell. The symptoms were undeniable and consistent: uncontrollable trembling, sudden blindness or deafness with no physical cause, mutism, nightmares, and a paralyzing inability to function under any further stress. What doctors were actually documenting, though they didn't have the language for it yet, was psychological trauma, what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress. The scale was staggering. By the war's end, the British Army had recorded roughly 80,000 official cases of shell shock, and many historians believe the true number, including men who were never formally diagnosed or who suffered in silence, was far higher. The military's response was, for much of the war, deeply inconsistent and often cruel. Some men received genuine medical treatment and rest at specialized hospitals. Others were accused of cowardice or lacking moral fiber, and in the most extreme and tragic cases, soldiers suffering from shell shock were court-martialed and executed for desertion when their trauma made them physically unable to return to the front line. Britain formally pardoned over 300 executed soldiers in 2006, acknowledging that many of them were very likely suffering from conditions we would now treat as serious mental illness, not punishable cowardice. Think about what that means. So a man could survive the mud, survive the rats, survive the shelling itself, and still be destroyed by his own army for a wound that simply didn't bleed where anyone could see it. This is exactly why the Blighty wound became something soldiers actually hoped for. Let's talk about why a bullet started to look like mercy. There was one more danger in the trenches that soldiers feared even more than shellfire, because it turned the air itself into a weapon. Germany first used chlorine gas on a large scale at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, releasing a greenish-yellow cloud that drifted across French and Algerian trenches, causing panic among troops who had no protection and no understanding of what was happening to them. Soldiers described the gas burning the throat and lungs, causing men to drown, in effect, from fluid building up in their own chest while still standing upright on dry land. Within months, both sides were using chemical weapons, and gas warfare escalated from chlorine to the far more dangerous phosgene, and eventually to mustard gas, which caused severe chemical burns to the skin, blindness, and internal damage that could kill a man slowly over days or weeks rather than instantly. Soldiers were issued gas masks, but the early versions were crude and unreliable, and a man who fumbled his mask during a surprise attack, or whose mask was faulty, had only seconds to get it right before the gas took hold. The psychological effect went far beyond the physical injuries. Soldiers described a specific lasting fear that followed them even on quiet days, because gas attacks could come without warning, carried on the wind, rather than fired directly at a target. Some veterans, decades later, said that certain smells alone could bring the panic of a gas attack rushing back instantly. Chemical weapons caused an estimated 1.3 million casualties across all sides during the war, though the number of deaths from gas specifically was lower than shellfire, largely because masks and training improved as the war went on. It's worth pausing on this, because it connects directly to something we're about to cover. A soldier who had survived mud, lice, shelling, and a gas attack, and was still standing in that trench months later, was carrying an accumulated weight most people today will never have to understand. And that weight is exactly what pushed so many of them toward one specific, desperate hope. A Blighty wound, the slang came from a British term for home, rooted in an old Hindi and Urdu word meaning foreign or British, used by soldiers who had served in India, was any injury serious enough to get a man sent back across the English Channel for treatment, but not serious enough to kill him or leave him permanently disabled. A clean shot through the fleshy part of an arm or leg, a hand injury that would heal, but couldn't hold a rifle for months. Medical officers and later historians documented real confirmed cases of self-inflicted wounds, where exhausted or traumatized soldiers deliberately shot themselves, usually through the hand or foot, in an attempt to escape the front line through injury rather than desertion, which carried the death penalty. The British Army took this seriously enough that they investigated suspicious wound patterns. A gunshot wound with powder burns at close range, for instance, or a wound in a hand held at an unnatural angle. And self-inflicted wounds were themselves a court-martial offence, sometimes punished severely. But here is what needs to be said clearly, because it's the emotional core of this entire video. The fact that some men chose to risk court-martial and self-mutilation rather than spend one more week in that trench tells you everything about what daily life there had actually become. This wasn't cowardice in any simple sense. It was men who had run out of any other way to survive a system that offered almost no other path out. Not desertion, which meant execution, and not simply enduring, which for many meant a slow physical and mental collapse in freezing mud, surrounded by disease and the constant threat of sudden death. A wound that would heal was, to some of these men, the only form of mercy the war seemed willing to offer. If this is the first time you're hearing the real reason behind that phrase, Blighty wound, you're exactly the audience this channel is built for. Consider subscribing, because we go this deep into the real history behind every war we cover, not the sanitized version. For a war defined by mud, disease, and constant fear, faith occupied an enormous and well-documented place in the daily life of soldiers on both sides. Army chaplains served directly in and near the front-line trenches, conducting burial services, hearing confessions, and simply sitting with men before they went over the top into an assault. Diaries and letters from soldiers across the British, French, German, and American forces repeatedly describe carrying small Bibles or prayer books in a breast pocket. Some soldiers credited these very books with stopping shrapnel, and multiple such Bibles, damaged but intact, are preserved today in war museums as physical evidence of those accounts. Chaplain Jeffrey Studdert Kennedy, nicknamed Woodbine Willie by British troops, because he handed out cigarettes along with spiritual comfort, became one of the most beloved figures of the war precisely because he refused to stay behind the lines. He moved through the trenches and no man's land itself to reach wounded and dying men, and was awarded the Military Cross for pulling injured soldiers to safety under fire. Soldiers' letters home from the trenches, preserved today in archives like the Imperial War Museum, repeatedly return to prayer. Not as a formal church-going ritual, but as something closer to a lifeline, said quietly before an attack, or whispered over a dying friend when no chaplain could reach them in time. For many men, faith was one of the only things the mud, the rats, and the shelling could not take away from them, because it didn't depend on the ground they were standing in. That same faith is part of what made one single day in December 1914 so extraordinary that it's still remembered as one of the most human moments of the entire war. On Christmas Eve 1914, in sections of the front line in Belgium and France, something happened that no general had ordered and no government had sanctioned. German soldiers began singing Stille Nacht, Silent Night, from their trenches. British soldiers, close enough to hear every word across no man's land, recognized the tune immediately and began singing the English lyrics back. By Christmas Day, in multiple documented sections of the line, soldiers from both sides climbed out of their trenches unarmed and met in no man's land itself, the same ground littered with the dead from earlier fighting. They exchanged small gifts, cigarettes, buttons, chocolate, alcohol. Multiple first-hand letters and diary accounts, since verified by historians, describe impromptu football matches played in no man's land with tin cans or actual footballs brought from the trenches. In several documented locations, soldiers from opposing sides used the temporary ceasefire to retrieve and bury their dead together, reciting shared prayers over men who, only hours earlier, had been trying to kill each other. High command on both sides was reportedly furious when they learned of the truce, worried it would undermine the will to fight, and issued orders forbidding any repeat of it in future years. And largely, it never was repeated at the same scale. By Christmas 1915, artillery bombardments were deliberately scheduled to prevent any similar fraternization. But for one night and one day, in the middle of a war that would eventually claim over 9 million military lives, ordinary soldiers on both sides chose, entirely on their own, to treat each other as men made in the same image, rather than enemies. It remains one of the most documented and most remembered moments of shared humanity in modern military history. If you had been standing in that trench that night, hearing the other side start singing a carol you knew by heart, we're genuinely curious what you think you would have done. Drop it in the comments below, because the answers on this channel are usually more thoughtful than you'd expect. The war ended on November 11th, 1918, but for the men who survived the trenches, the war didn't simply end that morning. Many returned home with lasting physical damage from amputated frostbitten limbs, chronic lung damage from poison gas exposure, and shell shock that, without the medical understanding or treatment available today, followed them for the rest of their lives. Divorce rates, unemployment, and institutionalization among veterans in the years following the war are documented in period government and medical records as significantly elevated compared to the general population, a quiet, largely unspoken cost of what these men had witnessed and endured. And yet, alongside that suffering, the letters, diaries, and testimonies these soldiers left behind also preserved something else. Moments of prayer before an assault, chaplains who refused to leave their side, carols sung across no man's land, and men who, even at their lowest point in a flooded trench, still reached for faith rather than despair. That too is part of the real historical record, and it deserves to be remembered with the same weight as the suffering itself. The war that was supposed to end all wars instead redrew the map of Europe, planted the seeds for a second global conflict just 21 years later, and left an entire generation of men carrying wounds that never showed up on any medical chart. So the next time you hear the phrase, "the trenches of World War I," remember what that phrase actually meant for the men living it. Mud that could swallow a boot hole, rats feeding in the dark, a disease with no name yet, and a bullet wound that some men were relieved, not devastated to receive. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the real record, not the myth, subscribe to Warblind, because next time we're going back to the skies over that same Western Front to tell you the true story of the fighter pilots who had a shorter life expectancy than almost any other soldier in the entire war. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.